And I'm not just excited for the fact that it's Q&A. I love Q&A. I'm excited for the fact that we haven't been able to do Q&A in like 3 months. We've had other activities going on and a lot of things that are happening at Highland Heights. And let me tell you, it really is encouraging to think about all that's happening with this congregation right now. Today, our young people began their Bible Bowl study sessions, preparing for, they're studying over the book of Exodus, and so they're going to be prepping for that for the Lads to Leaders Convention up on Easter weekend. We've had a lot of other different activities going on, just with baby showers, and we've had retreats in the last couple of months where we've had gospel meetings, and we have all kinds of things that are happening. It's just really encouraging to be part of an active community of faithful people. And I am so blessed to be able to be a part of this family here with you, and I'm grateful for that. But tonight is Q&A, and we're excited for it. In case you are not familiar with Q&A, this is just about what it sounds like. We've had questions submitted by members of the congregation. Occasionally, we'll get some that come in from outside of the congregation, but we just Bible-related questions that we open up the Word of God, and we try to figure out if we can come to some sort of understanding of what we should be doing, or understanding of situations in the Bible that maybe cause us to scratch our heads a little bit. Sometimes we come to good, solid answers. Sometimes we can't get the whole answer, but we put ourselves down a path for further study. And tonight's going to be interesting. We're going to be spending pretty much all of our time, almost all of our time in the Old Testament. I have questions that have come in out of Samuel and Kings tonight, so be prepared for that. We're going to be looking at a lot of Israel's history and some questions that come up from those. So we won't waste any time. We'll just go ahead and get on into it. Our first question is about David and Goliath, or the scenario of David and Goliath. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 19 through 23, King Saul asked for David specifically, and David came and played the harp for him. Plus, we are told that he became his armor bearer. In 1 Samuel 17, verses 55 through 58, when David had killed Goliath, King Saul does not know David or where he came from. So the question is, did King Saul know David before Goliath or only afterwards? Let's take a look at a couple of these passages just so that we have them read. Open up to 1 Samuel chapter 16, if you would, and we'll start there. The depiction of the events is very accurate, and I appreciate it being done in the way that they did. But in 1 Samuel chapter 16, we do have this scenario. You see where King Saul, we are told at the beginning that the Spirit of the Lord has left King Saul. God has rejected him from being king. And God's Spirit having departed from Saul, it looks like there's that vacuum, so to speak. And the Bible says that Saul was tormented by an evil spirit. We don't know exactly what the nuance of that was. There's a lot of different ideas about it, but it does seem to manifest itself in depression and some of that what today we might call manic or bipolar type depression. It's how it manifests itself. Saul is just on this roller coaster ride of emotions, and what they have figured out is that good music is able to calm his soul. And so they go out and they search out for David. One of Saul's servants knows him by name, says, this is a boy, he knows how to play the harp well. He can come and he can play that music. Well, so let's look at verses 19 through 23, and we find what is said there. Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse, and he said, send me David your son, who is with the sheep. And Jesse took a donkey laden with bread and a skin of wine and a young goat, and sent them to David, by David his son to Saul. And David came and to Saul, entered his service. Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent Jesse, saying, let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight. And whenever the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre, and he played it with his hand. And so Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. Now skip over to chapter 17 as we get to the end of the story of the encounter of David battling Goliath. we find this statement beginning in verse 55. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I don't know." And the king said, "Inquire whose son the boy is." And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." This is a question that has actually puzzled a lot of people regarding David and Saul's knowledge, because the chronology just seems odd, right? And these details at a surface glance, they do seem to be conflicting. It's a little hitch in the chronology. Let me give you, before we get an answer, I do want to give you an aspect about Jewish history that I think is worth knowing. When we open up our history books as Westerners, we have a certain mentality about our history. We like things to be linear and chronological. We want to know the exact order of events as best we can. We judge the quality of a history book based upon how accurately it can put the events in order. And when we find discrepancies, when we find events that are being tossed out of order, we tend, as Western thinkers, we tend to give it less credibility. But one thing that's important to understand about Jewish history, Middle Eastern and Eastern history, is while it is true that they were concerned about aspects of chronology, chronology was not their top priority. When they would write a history book, they had a certain goal in mind. They were trying to convey a certain message, perhaps a message about the person or the people that they were writing about. It might be that they were trying to answer a certain question, such as why did certain things unfold? Why are things unfolding in our present? And they'll go back and they'll say, well, this is why. And they are less concerned with the chronology as they are with painting a specific picture of the person or people in mind, or the events that they are depicting. And so every now and then, what you will find in history that is written by Jewish authors, you're going to find that there is less concern about getting the events in the exact order. They'll be in relative order, but they're not as concerned about getting them in completely exact order. Let me give you a for example. If you were to open up the Gospels and you saw Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we call those the synoptic Gospels. It means to see through the same eye. And the reason why we call them the synoptics is because they tell the same stories. John is kind of in a gospel category all of his own, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the same stories regarding the life of Jesus. And we would think to ourselves, man, that sounds really redundant. Until you realize that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, while they tell a lot of the same stories in Jesus' life, they don't put them in the same order. They don't put them in the same order. And so it leaves you to question, well, when did this happen in Jesus' ministry? Well, that was less of the concern, because you would have, let's just say Matthew, for example. Matthew had a purpose in his writing. His purpose was to convince his Jewish readers that Jesus was the prophesied about Messiah. And so you will see that emphasis in the stories he selects, in the way that he tells them, and the specific details that he gives about them. So the same could be true here regarding David and Goliath, or David and Saul. We see a hitch in the chronology, and it gives us as Westerners a lot of heartburn. Did Saul know him or didn't he? Because it seems like he should have known him by now. But I tell you all of that, it's helpful to understand that about Jewish history accounts, because it will help you not get too hung up and be bothered too much by the fact that orders of events may not be in the exact line of events that we would normally want to see. And that's okay. It doesn't take away from the accuracy of the account. The better question is going to be, what was the message and the point of the book The point of Samuel, the books of Samuel, is to tell you about the Jewish monarchy. Specifically at this point in the story, what we are beginning to find is David as introduced as arguably the greatest king, certainly greater than Saul, and David being the one through whom the Jewish kingdom is going to thrive. And so he is telling stories about the rise of David's power. That's what you're seeing here. So even with that said, this particular conundrum with 1 Samuel 16 and 17 is a bit strange. How is it that Saul does not seem to know David in chapter 17 at the end of all of this? You would think that being his armor bearer, that he would know the guy. Well, for whatever it's worth, you also maybe want to understand this. Just because it says that David was Saul's armor bearer doesn't mean he was his only armor bearer. We aren't told about the other ones, but it was common practice for kings of that day to have multiple shield bearers. Also, it may also be worth noting that at this point in the story of David, David is not living in Saul's castle or palace or house. David is given permission to go back and forth between Saul's service and Jesse, his home in Bethlehem. Because you'll also find toward the end of this account in chapter 17, beginning of 18, that Saul said, "You're not going home anymore, you're staying here." And so when it says that, when at the end of chapter 16, he said, "Let David remain in my service," it doesn't mean that he lived with Saul. It means that he was exacted into Saul's servitude. He was at Saul's beck and call. When the king needed him, he came. So the fact of the matter is that Saul does know David. But there is a detail in 1 Samuel 17 that will give us an answer to what's happening at the end of the chapter. The answer to Saul's specific question about David's identity is given, the reason why he asked that question comes earlier in the chapter. Notice specifically what it is that Saul asks. He doesn't say, "Who is this boy?" That's kind of the way that we see it in our minds, and that's the way we wind up repeating it. He doesn't know who David is. He said, "Who is this kid?" That's not what he asks. What does he ask? He says, "Whose son is this?" Abner, whose son is this? I don't know. Then you need to go inquire whose son he is. When he comes to him, he says, "David, whose son are you?" And David doesn't say, "My name is David." He says, "I am the son of Jesse the Bethlehemite." Now, why does he bother with whose son is he? Back up a few verses and let's go into chapter 17. Look around verses 24 and 25. David has come to the battle line. He's brought his gifts that his father sent, and he runs down to the battle line with everybody, and he's causing this little commotion. Goliath has come out, issued his daily challenge that he's been doing for the last month or a little over a month. And David is going around saying, "Why is this happening? Why is nobody standing up to him? Hey, by the way, what's going to happen for the guy who fights the giant?" Notice what the people say in verse 25. "And the men of Israel said, 'Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel.'" Do you notice the last part? What is part of the promised reward for killing the giant? Your father's household will be free. Now, what does it mean to be free? Most scholars agree or think that it probably had something to do with the taxation, whatever level or form of taxation that they had in that time. That if you will come out and kill the giant, I will make the soldier rich, I will make him my son-in-law, and I will exempt his family from taxes for the rest of their lives. That might be enough to make me go out against Goliath. Maybe not, but it might be. And so I think this is what's actually happening here. When he comes up, it's not that Saul doesn't know David. He's certainly baffled by David's courage, but I think that the actual question comes back to, this is not an identity question of David, it's a lineage question. Whose family does he belong to? Because he's made a promise. The promise is they're going to be free. They're going to be exempt from, again, presumably exempt from taxes. And so when they're doing that, we need to find out how many living relatives he's got, because this is supposed to extend to his father's whole family, to his household. And so that's really what's happening. And that's why he goes in, and so what you would assume is that from there, Saul will go on and investigate, and he would make Jesse's household free in all of Israel. The interesting thing about it, and maybe a discussion for a later time, is that Saul seems to drag his feet on making that happen. Certainly we know he drags his feet on making David his son-in-law. And it's not even with, I think we pointed out in our Thursday class the other day, it's not even with the daughter that was part of the promise. But I think that's what's happening. So is this a true hitch in the chronology? Not necessarily. It seems to me that this is more of an identity, not an identity question of who is David, but it's him inquiring of the lineage that he comes from so that he can make good on his promise that he made in 17 verse 25. So there we go. Second question. We're going to go to 1 Kings now. So in 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 30 through 32, and 35 through 36, Ahijah the prophet tells Jeroboam that he is going to receive 10 tribes to be king over, and that Rehoboam will receive 1 tribe to rule. In actuality, Rehoboam gets 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, according to 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 21. Why would the prophet keep saying that Jeroboam gets 10 tribes and Rehoboam only gets 1 when he actually gets 2? So here is another one of those questions where it looks like there is a discrepancy. It looks like maybe there's some missing facts here, or a misstating of facts. And these are the kinds of things that skeptics jump all over, right? So number one, let's consider consider a couple of things. It is a strange scenario. I'll give you that for a couple of reasons. One, for the reason that's stated above in the question, and that's what we'll look at here in a moment. The question shows, man, he's only saying 1 when he's actually getting 2. What's the deal? I also think it's an unusual question because the math doesn't work. How many tribes of Israel are there? 12 tribes. It's the way it's been ever since Jacob had his 12 sons. What's 10 plus 1? Not 12. It's 11. And so we have a tribe missing. Why do we have a tribe missing? Are they unimportant? Or is there something assumed? What's going on? So there's a couple of reasons why this sounds unusual or strange, and some would say perhaps a little bit fishy. Number one, so we figure out, what we do find out according to 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 21. If you look at what it says down there, chapter 12, verse 21, when Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he assembled all the houses of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. So who are the 2 tribes that Rehoboam gets? It's Judah and Benjamin. Maybe I should take a moment and refresh our memory about what's happening here historically, because this may not be common knowledge to everybody. In the books of Samuel, God institutes the monarchy. Begins with King Saul, transitions over to King David. David is the one who has the dynastic line. So after David comes Solomon. And we read of Solomon's story through the first little bit of 1 Kings and in Chronicles. But along the way, because of some foolishness on Solomon's part, and we find that, frankly, Rehoboam is not all that wise in his own right, but because of some foolishness on Solomon's part, God says, I'm going to rip the kingdom away, and I'm going to give it to somebody else. But he says, I also made a promise to David. I promised David that he would always have a descendant on the throne. And this is also messianic. This is pointing ahead to Jesus, this promise to David. And so God is going to keep His promise. He says, I'm going to keep a descendant of David on the throne at all times. That's Rehoboam. But God has also said, as punishment for what Solomon did, He's going to have to rip some of the kingdom away. So He finds this guy Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And Jeroboam is really the only true enemy that Solomon has. And in this scenario, what you have happen is that the Ahijah the prophet comes up, he takes a new cloak, he rips it apart into the 12 different strips, and he gives 10 to Jeroboam, and he reserves the other 2. And he says, Jeroboam, the Lord has declared that 10 tribes are going to follow you. This winds up being the northern 10 tribes of the kingdom that we wind up calling the kingdom of Israel in the divided kingdom. The southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, go by the name of Judah. And they are always ruled by a descendant of David. That's what's happening historically. So the question here then is, why does the prophet not include Benjamin in the initial prophecy? That's who's missing here from this, right? He says Judah's going to go with Rehoboam, but why not Benjamin? Why didn't he mention it? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. A couple of things to consider. One, it could be that it was assumed and didn't need to be stated, that it was assumed that Benjamin would stay under Davidic rule. And in order for that to make sense, you might need to pull up one of your old maps of the dividing of the tribes. Do you know what the capital city of Israel was? Jerusalem, right? And most of the time we understand or we think about Jerusalem being in Judah territory. Here's the interesting thing though. When you go back and you look at the 12 tribes allotted out, Jerusalem is not part of Judah's territory. You know who it belongs to? Benjamin. Bethlehem is part of Judah, but Jerusalem is actually part of Benjamin's territory. Well, at this point in the game, Jerusalem is the capital city for the kingdom. So it may just very well be assumed that Benjamin is going to stay with Rehoboam under Davidic rule, and so the prophet didn't see the need to mention Benjamin by name. That's possible. But I think what you can also add to this is kind of going back to what we mentioned here in the first question. That when you come to Jewish history, chronology is one thing, but what's more important is the question of what is the point? What is the primary message that the author is trying to get across? One of the major messages of Israel's writings and all of these things is they are looking ahead to the Messiah. And if you know a little bit about the prophecies regarding where the Messiah was going to come from, the Messiah comes through one specific tribe, and it is the tribe of Judah, out of the family lineage of David. And so it may also be that in the course of the prophecy, the way that it gets written for us, that what we can consider is that what Ahijah is focused on, or at least what the author of Kings is focused on, is Judah. It's not that Benjamin is unimportant, but Judah is really important. Because Judah has to stay under Davidic rule. There has to be a descendant of David on that throne because God made a promise that it was going to be through the line of David, through the tribe of Judah, that the Messiah was going to come. So those are two possibilities. Can we be really exact and hardcore in our answer of why this discrepancy is here? No, I don't think that we can have a hard and fast answer. But maybe this gives us a couple of viewpoints to consider. This is why you get only one tribe mentioned in chapter 11, but you get the two tribes mentioned in chapter 12. Next question, we're going to stay in Kings, and we're going to skip ahead a few chapters. We're going to get to chapter 13. 1 Kings chapter 13 tells of a prophet who talks to Jeroboam and is told to not eat or drink and to leave from Jeroboam in a certain direction. In the course of it, an older prophet catches up to this young prophet and tells him, hey, the Lord wants you to come back with me. If the young prophet knew that the old prophet was really a prophet, why would he doubt what the older prophet told him was wrong? He was doing what he thought the Lord wanted him to do. Now, there's a detail not in the question. Let's sort out some of the details of the situation. So we get this divided kingdom now. Jeroboam takes the northern half. Rehoboam takes the southern. Unfortunately, Jeroboam proves to be a very wicked-hearted man. He leads Israel into absolute apostasy, down a road of idolatry. He sets up golden calves in the southern end of the kingdom and the northern end of the kingdom. In the northern part, he goes into the city of Dan. In the southern part, he comes to the city called Bethel. And he sets up these shrines with golden calves. And he establishes a sort of hybrid religion in order to try to keep all of these 10 tribes loyal to him. And the people just eat it hook, line, and sinker. They are all over this new pagan religion. That is what this prophet comes to Jeroboam to talk about. The Lord is not pleased with this at all. And so he sends this prophet to reprimand Jeroboam, to also point out to him, you are going to be judged for this evil that you have brought against Israel. But the details along the way, as the question says, the prophet was told, when you go there, you give this message, you don't stop to eat, you don't stop to drink with anybody in that territory, and you leave on a different route than what you came in on. God was very specific. Jeroboam even tried to get the prophet, hey, come with me, let's sit down and share a meal. He says, no, I won't do it, I'm leaving. So as he leaves, an older prophet finds out about it and catches up with him and says, hey, the Lord revealed to me, an angel came to me and said that you needed to come eat at my house. And so the younger prophet falls for it. The Bible will actually tell us that this older prophet lied to him. God had not told him this. And so the young prophet goes back, and while they are eating and sharing this meal, the Lord does send a message to the older prophet. And the message is to the young prophet, you disobeyed me, you're not going to make it home. He finishes the meal and he leaves, and as he's leaving, he is attacked by a lion on the road. And he's killed. And you know that this is from God, because as you go down and you read the story, it says that the lion does not eat him. The lion doesn't even kill his donkey. He just kills the man, and he stands there until the older prophet comes with his sons, and they find the lion standing over his body. They take him and they bury him there in Bethel. So the question here is, why is God killing this young prophet? Why is he taking out this anger? Because if I was in this guy's shoes, I would have believed the older prophet. So why did God not cut him some slack? Well, this is going to be one of those hard questions to deal with and hard answers rather to have to swallow. Because I agree, this is a harsh response from God. But I do think that there is a satisfactory explanation that's rooted in the concept of holiness before God. We need to remind ourselves, what we need to remember about this whole situation is that the prophet's divine commission, this young prophet had a specific job. His job was to go and communicate God's utter disdain for and judgment upon the actions by Jeroboam. And I think this is why God expressly forbade him from receiving any hospitality in Bethel. Because what does it mean? I mean, we know enough about this culture. If you sit down and share a meal in this culture, what is that insinuating? That we have commonness, that we are in agreement, that I am full-fledged behind you and we are linked arm in arm. Now, we would think maybe that's not as much as we might put on a meal, but in this day and time, that was a big deal. Do not accept hospitality from these people because that insinuates that you are in agreement with what they are doing. And so God says you are to have nothing from them. You do not accept anything from their hands, and you go back a different way from which you came. And I might even add to it that the young prophet should have probably found it a little strange that there was still a prophet of God in Bethel. If this older prophet was so faithful to God, why had he stayed there in the epicenter of this idolatrous worship? But you see, here's what was supposed to happen. This younger prophet, his conduct was supposed to symbolize God's total rejection of all of Israel's false worship. His conduct, his actions there in Bethel were supposed to be an added symbol of how angry God was at this situation. And so the point is that he should have just stayed on mission. If this prophet, this younger prophet, should have understood what was at stake, and that God was so emphatic about the judgment against Jeroboam and Israel that he should have known that God was not going to have him deviate from this because of what that meal and that hospitality would have symbolized. And so the shared meal would have carried with it the suggestion of alliance between the man of God from Judah and the prophets of Bethel. And God was not pleased with that. And that's why he had to be punished. Is it harsh? Well, I can probably make an argument that it was harsh because he was deceived. But I think that's the reason. I think this is the reason why he has to have this punishment as he does. Last question, and we'll be done for the night. Why do we always ask God to be with us? Isn't he always with us? Great observation. And in answer to the question, I think what will help us answer it is to take a moment and realize that there are a couple of different meanings to the concept to be with us. One which is being referenced here in the question, the questioner says, isn't God always with us? This is a reference to what we've come to know or what we've come to call as God's omnipresence. That's a fancy word that means God is everywhere all at the same time. And in that regard, God is always with us. God has a presence all throughout this creation, and there is never any place that He is not. The Bible testifies to this. Open up to Psalm 139 for a moment. And in Psalm 139, we'll just grab a couple of verses here. If we were to pick up reading in verse 7 of Psalm 139, the psalmist says, "Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to the heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and I dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you." So the psalmist recognizes that God is everywhere. There's nowhere you can go that God is not. And we'll see similar statements in, say, Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 23 and 24. There, the Lord says, "Am I a God at hand, declares the Lord, and not a God far away? Can a man hide himself in secret places so that I cannot see him, declares the Lord? Do I not fill heaven and earth, declares the Lord?" So, to the question at hand, isn't God always with us? Well, there is a sense, yes, in which God is always with us. In that He's everywhere. You're never going to be able to hide from God. But there is a second meaning to the concept of God being with us that's more than just God having a presence in the room. Because the phrase "to be with us" will also mean that God is strengthening and supporting and empowering us. For instance, in Exodus chapter 3, verses 11 and 12, as God is recruiting Moses to go to Pharaoh to bring his people out of Egyptian bondage, Moses is trying to come up with all these different reasons why he's not going to be able to do it. I'm not able to speak well, and I'm not really strong, and God, I just don't know that I can do it. Well, in the course of this, God makes the statement in verses 11 and 12, "I will be with you. I will be with your mouth. I will be with your tongue, and I will give you the words that you need to speak." What does God mean there? He's not talking about His omnipresence. He's saying, I am going to be supporting you. I'm going to be strengthening you for this mission at hand. And that's the difference between these two scenarios. Why do we ask God to be with us? Well, we're not asking Him to have His omnipresence with us. What we're asking for is His support. We're asking for His backing and His strengthening and His empowering. It's kind of like, the difference can be understood when you think about, say, a debate between two people. If Gary and I were going to have a debate and he's up here on the stage and he's going to argue one point and I'm going to argue the other point, we may look out over the crowd and every person that's out there is with us, right? Because you're in the room. But here's what we're also going to know about a debate. There's going to be a certain portion of you that are with me. And there's going to be a certain portion of you that are with him. Why? Because you support him. You're there to back him up. You're there to agree with him and to do whatever you can to help boost him along or to boost me along, depending upon whose side you're with on that. And so the same is true with God. What are we asking for? We're asking God, well, I need your presence. I need you active in my life. And we ask that of God because, and this is how we're going to wrap up tonight, we ask that of God because what we also know is that there have been and there are times in which God's presence can and does depart from His people. His omnipresence is still intact, but He is no longer with them. For instance, Israel gives their covenant in Exodus, Israel's dealings with God in Exodus chapter 40 and 1 Kings chapter 8 at the dedication of the tabernacle and the temple. God demonstrates that He is with them by filling those structures with smoke in His glory to the point that they had to leave the room because they couldn't fulfill their duties. And what did the people understand? God lives here. He is with us. But what do we read in Ezekiel chapter 10? In Ezekiel chapter 10, the prophet sees a vision of God's glory departing from the temple and riding away in a chariot or on the wings of those angels. And what do we realize from that? That God's presence was no longer with Israel after that point. We've already mentioned about King Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 10. King Saul, it says that the Spirit of God was upon him, rushed upon him, and then we get this idea that God's Spirit was with Saul. But then in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel it says, and God's Spirit departed from him. And the same can be true of Christians. The same can be true of Christians. God's presence can be with us, but there are times in which even baptized believers can lose the presence of God. In Hebrews chapter 10, verses 26 and 27, the Hebrew author asks the question, if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but rather a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. What does that tell us? It tells us that if I want to have peace in my life, if I want to have confidence, if I want to have a hope of heaven, I need more than just God's omnipresence. I need God's close, supportive, saving, merciful presence in my life. That's why we ask God to be with us. Because we know that if He's not with us, there is no hope. And tonight, as we are wrapping this up, we could ask a simple question as you think about your own life. Is God with you? Can you confidently say that the Lord is with you in your life? Are you walking faithfully by His side? Are you trusting in Him and His ways? Or are you trying to rely on your own strength and your own ability? Are you allowing sin back into your life, back into your Christian life, to the point that you might be on a path to where there will be no more sacrifice remaining for you? Are you here tonight and you're not a Christian at all? You haven't given your life to Jesus. You haven't given your life to God through obedience to the gospel. If you have not obeyed the gospel, then church, the long and the short of it is that God is not with you. It's not me being mean. That's me stating what the Bible states. Wouldn't it be great if you could change that scenario before you left this building tonight? You can. You have an opportunity right now. We're going to sing a song to come and respond to the Lord's invitation. If we can pray with you, if we can help you in giving your life to Jesus through obedience to the gospel, we want to help you. The question is, what will you do while we stand and sing?